Peter Jordan, you've enjoyed a long and very successful career as an international photojournalist. Could we begin by talking about a photograph you took in Rhodesia in 1976, I think it was?
Yeah, I think that's Gerard Farage you're talking about. He was a Belgian farmer, an immigrant in Rhodesia. And a couple of us went there to cover the war. He had a VW and he cut the roof off because it was much easier for his guard. And yeah, that was it. It sort of worked as an interesting
remarkable
picture.
Photograph. And on that same sort of tour of duty in '76, you were working for Newsweek, I think, part of the time.
Yeah, I was there actually. I was doing a little bit of work for Terry Fincher, which was Photographers International that he had then, and so I was ready to work for anybody. And the local stringer for Newsweek asked me to go and photograph some troops, and I did pictures, and one of them was stunning really. It was a black soldier from the Rhodesian Light Infantry, and behind him was a white soldier, and this made quite a good composite, I thought. Newsweek ran it as a cover, which infuriated the Rhodesian authorities, because the label with it, or the headline, was "How long can whites of Rhodesia survive?" So they saw this as a direct affront, and there was a political message to it, and I was asked to leave. So I didn't take any notice for a few days. And then they came to my house and said, "You've got to pack up and go." And I was taken to the airport, and the local paper ran a short story that I'd been deported.
Right. Back to London?
No, I went back to South Africa. So when I arrived in South Africa, it was around about, it could have been the 17th, I can't remember the exact date, of June 1976. The riots had broken out in Soweto. A lot of people don't know what Soweto stands for, so I'll tell you because it's sort of interesting. It stands for Southwestern Townships, and that's how the South African authorities at those times designated places, and they became names, but really it was where black people lived, and Johannesburg was mostly for white people living during the apartheid regime. That's how it worked.
We must talk about the photograph of the man in the single men's quarters in...
I'd gone into Soweto, and I was on my own again, and wandering around, and went up to the single men's quarters, and I went in, and there was a row of about 6 lavatories, and all the partitions had been removed, probably by people who wanted a bit of a wall or piece of cardboard for whatever the partitions were for their house. So it was completely open with all these lavatories, no lavatory seats, and pretty basic. And there was a guy sitting on the loo. I sort of quietly walked in, and he seemed to ignore me, and I took a few pictures of him sitting on the loo. He saw me and then stood up, and I stood in front of him and took these pictures. And it really shows how desperate the situation was, and how cruel it could be, and how unfair it all seemed, without actually, it says a lot. And also it says a lot about the humility, that here was this man, and he wasn't angry at me or anything like that. He was so downtrodden. So it's a very, it touches my heart, that picture. One morning we woke up, and I used to get the paper in the morning, and it was on the front page of the Johannesburg Star, and it announced that Steve Biko, who was a very popular nationalist leader at the time, had died. And it was very little other details about that. So during the day it emerged he died in police custody. And so I took myself off to East London to cover the funeral. I drove around town with a friend of mine from NBC looking for the funeral house where maybe Steve Biko was being kept. And we went into one, and they were carving a coffin. I said, "Can I take it? Is that a coffin for Steve Biko?" And they said yes. So I took some pictures of them working, And they said, do you want to see him? I said, he's here? And they said, yes, he's come with us. And they took me to a huge zinc fridge that you could walk into. And he was laying on the floor. So I took a picture of him laying there, and you could clearly see his head was fractured.
The injuries, yeah.
Yeah, from his injuries. And I said, well, where's he going from here? And they said, oh, to his house. And these guys gave me the address. So the next morning I was up early with Martin, and off we went to this house. We were the only white people there. It was all blacks chanting and singing, and it was an incredible thing. And then I was invited into the house, and that was the picture that had eluded me before from in the fridge. It wasn't so pleasant. This was in his coffin with a mirror under the lid, and his wife was behind the coffin, and his sister, and that ran as a cover on Newsweek and was used internationally.
So Peter, you're going to be in Africa for another 3 years or more with Time, aren't you?
Yes.
And during that period, what other significant events did you cover in Africa?
Apartheid was always a sort of background story. The Americans in 77 and 78 thought that South Africa was about to collapse and it would become an independent state. Rhodesia, which became Zimbabwe, was already heading towards that way. I did stories up in Somalia, the Western Somalian Liberation Front. I went into Ethiopia and then joined up with a band of guerrillas from the National Liberation Front of Eritrea. Pretty dire stuff, hardly any food there, but it was interesting. I travelled with them for about a week. But also, there was other stuff going on. So there was a report that there'd been some fighting in the Congo, in a town called Kolwezi, which was a big copper producing area, huge mines run by the Belgians and the French. And it sounded pretty horrific. There was all the workers from the European workers were being captured, and some of them being killed, the reports were. So the next day there was a flight on Swiss Air to Kinshasa, and I was put on a C-130 down to Kinshasa, and then transferred onto another plane into Kolwezi. So most of the print journalists, they had to go back on the plane because they couldn't file any of their reports from there. There were no communications. And no one much stayed behind. And I sort of tossed a coin and said, I'll stay. And I walked over to some huts around the airport, and I came across some Belgian paratroopers, and they had a jeep, and they said, jump in. And so I went with them into town. And then the horror of what had happened unfolded, walking around and travelling around this town for the next 2 days was terrible, horrific.
So could you tell us how you found your way back into Rhodesia, Peter, having been excluded for a period of time?
Yeah, that's sort of quite interesting because I'd been doing all these things around Africa, and Time magazine was now beginning to focus on Rhodesia because the war had become quite brutal, and it looked like things were going to turn around. And then in the Commonwealth Conference in 1979, Margaret Thatcher had just been appointed. I went up for Time to Zambia to cover the events there. The Queen was there and Margaret Thatcher, and during that time, she met with the guerrilla leaders, Nkomo and Mugabe, and peace talks were about to start. So when that happened, Time made an application for me to return to Salisbury, as it was called then, which is now Harare. So I had an in immediately when Mugabe's guys arrived in town. I was there photographing them, and one of the pictures, I went to one of these demonstrations shortly after, and there was a load of obviously former guerrillas. They were lovely faces, and they were smiling, and they were looking for a future. It was very, very moving to see the joy on people's faces that they knew independence was coming. The current government, of course, were in denial, and they couldn't believe it. And I had friends there, white friends, on the night of the election results when Mugabe won, sort of turned against me a bit and felt that I'd betrayed them because they thought I was supportive of the nationalists. But it was a shame, really. But yes, so that Africa sort of ended there for me.
And so, moving a little bit forward in time, you started to work for Time magazine in the Middle East. You go to Lebanon.
I went to replace another photographer. He was also a friend of mine, called Harry Matheson. And I arrived in Beirut, and the reason he was leaving, he'd been there for some months, and it's a nerve-wracking kind of a place. But he'd gone out one day, and a rocket came through the window of his hotel window and obliterated his room. And he sort of said, good job wasn't there. So Harry was very happy to be going home. So I settled in Commodore Hotel that everyone sort of knew at the time. They had a parrot at the bar that used to imitate incoming shells, and everyone would rush around. The Americans had come in. There was not only Americans, there was French, Italians and English, but the Americans were for me, the important force. The rest were a sideshow, really. So they'd come in, they'd not built, but they dug in around the airport. They had bunkers, and then Marines are not used to settling down. They don't travel with tents or anything, so they occupied the airport building for most of their administration guys and troops and things like that. But dug in by the runway, they had a couple of snipers, so I couldn't get into the dugout. It was below ground level, so his rifle would have been poking out just above ground level, but he was standing up. So, and there was no room for me, but there was a little air space at the back. So I took the top off my Nikon, which you could do then, the prism would come off. And I put my hands down, and so I could look into the prism like you would a Hasselblad or a Rolleiflex. And I took pictures of him there with a 24mm lens so I could get it all in. Some days later, something else happened. And that is one of the largest bombs ever constructed drove onto the American base, through the gates. It drove in and underneath the underground car park, and suicide bomber took out the whole building. It came down 4 stories, completely flat. It seemed apparent at the time there were no survivors, and they were looking through the rubble, and they found a guy alive, which was just incredible. And they were dragging him out of the rubble. We were being shot at, by the way. You could hear the rounds going past us, above us. So that picture, I won the Overseas Press Club Award for that, best photography for the year, for the Overseas Press Club. The New York Guild of Journalists had it as well. And yeah, it was a famous picture, I suppose, at the time.
For the next 2 or 3 years, you had a very interesting ongoing assignment.
Yeah, I after that, I sort of get home, family, being away a lot. It's very, you know, it's not so exciting anymore when you start going to war zones and things like that. So I'd gone in for a minor operation on my sinuses or something, and during the night they blew up the hotel in Brighton, and that's when that happened. Reagan had been an assassination attempt against his life, and the Pope. So Time had a whole pile of people following Reagan, which they would anyway, but they had even more. They had another guy in Rome permanently with the Pope, so they wanted a similar thing. So that was the approach I took. And I had a meeting with Bernard Ingham, and I explained that there was this close relationship between Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan. and the Americans, you know, want to exploit that and cover it. And they saw, I think Downing Street saw some kudos in it for them to have some more foreign coverage. And I began to build up quite a relationship. She used to write back and thank me for pictures and stuff like that. So, and then one day, it was during the President Reagan's trip to England. Late one afternoon, I got a call from Downing Street, and they said, "Are you free tonight?" And I said, "Yes." And they said, "Could you come to Downing Street and take a picture of the Prime Minister with President Reagan?" So she came and they stood. I said, "Well, I'd like you to be here, and I'll try and get you together." And he said, "And who do you work for?" And I said, "I'm a staff photographer with Time magazine." And he said, "Oh, so you're one of ours?" She said, "No, Mr. President, he's one of ours." Which everyone started chuckling behind, you know. And
you also did a series of Mrs. Thatcher, Prime Minister, in Downing Street, not only in her office but also private side. Was that done in one day, or was it over a period of time?
That took quite a bit of organising. It was it wasn't Bernard Ingham, but it was one of his people, and I went there and I said, "Look, I've got to speak to the Prime Minister about this before I do this shoot." So it was arranged. I had a 15-minute slot on one day, and I went in and I said, "Yeah, I'd really like to be able to show you in different outfits and change clothes." She said, "Oh, what a great idea. Oh, I'll get Mrs. Ponsonby from Aquascutum to come down with a couple of racks of clothes." So on the day in question, I get there and she said, "Well, what shall I wear now?" And then she had all these clothes. So that was my first picture of the day, was her with all these clothes and Mrs. Ponsonby, and it made quite fun. And then there was odd things. There was a load of teddy bears, and she said, "Oh, I want some pictures with my teddy bears." And so it started off really kind of laid back. And we went from one room to another, and we came to the end, and that's it, it's a wrap. There was a courier waiting there. It was a staffer from Life, a courier, who was going to go straight away and hand carry it, get it to New York. And she was also a writer, I should have said. Off they went. I was packing up, and she said, "Oh, I've forgotten. You didn't photograph me in my evening wear. I've got this new evening gown." And I said, "Oh, yeah, we can do that." But she just looked absolutely cracking. It was fantastic, and she was radiant. It was a photographer's dream. It was fantastic. So I thought, this is incredible. All the pictures have gone. They're on deadline. I've got to do something about this. So I didn't shoot it on Kodachrome. I switched to Fuji and put that in my pocket. And then she said, "Do you mind taking a picture of Dennis and I for our Christmas card?" So I said, "Oh, go on then." And she went off and changed again into a blue outfit. And he came, and I did a picture of him on the stairs. And I got it processed. There's a 5-hour time difference between New York, so I saw this stuff when it came through, and I phoned up Peter Howe and I said, "Look, got this cracking picture of her on the stairs." And he said, "It's too late. We've got the space allocated. The pictures will be coming in soon, and we're closing. It'll be closed by tomorrow morning." So I said, "Look, I can put them on the Concorde Saturday morning. Why not?" He said, "Give it a try and I'll have a look." Anyway, I sent them, and it ran it as a double truck, which is a 2-page entrance to it. And then after that went on a lot of covers. The Observer used it as a cover, and Europe. It was used everywhere.
You sort of left photography. When was that? You went to live in Italy and doing something completely different.
I did. I didn't feel comfortable with the transition with digital and computers.
And now you're back in the UK, and we were introduced to each other. Leo Mason kindly introduced us originally. And your archive is with Popperfoto.
Yes, it is.
Can you talk a little bit about the emotional side of making that decision? And
it is. It's a difficult thing for photographers because obviously there's money involved, and it's never going to be actually enough, sort of thing. And I think if I was 30 years old, I would never have sold my pictures to anybody, because there was a living thing with me. But as you get older, unless you have the energy to be working on it on a daily basis, of which I want to do other things in life, and I like to go out and sit in the sun as well, it's not much use. So it's there, and I think if we're all going to die one day, and I die and I've done nothing with it, and it's all in boxes, it will probably end up in a skip, which is what happens, as we know. And then if someone does get hold of it, they can't identify what it is properly, and they won't know any of the connections with it. And so afterwards I was a bit depressed for a little while, because I had to think about it. What have you done? And then I sort of felt a bit of a relief, and I've got to know the people at Popperfoto, and you have to trust and feel there's a weight been taken off your shoulders, but you've not lost it. You still feel you've got a connection with these things. And I'm seeing pictures again I hadn't looked at for actually a long time.
Peter Jordan, it's been fascinating talking to you this morning. Thank you so much.
Thank you.